In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 9, where last chapter, to understand demand shocks better, we re-examined aggregate demand. Now in this chapter, we will learn to explicitly keep track of the unemployment rate and inflation rate in an economy by developing the Phillips curve model, in which we will consider the long and short run Phillips curves to then put the two together to have our Phillips curve model in its entirety. Where in terms of today's discussion on the long run Phillips curve, what we will do is we will recall our co-movements between the unemployment rate and inflation rate so that we can derive the long run Phillips curve, consider how the curve shifts, then conclude with the summary. With all this in mind, beginning with our preliminaries, thus far in terms of business cycles, what we can do is explain movement in an economy from a full employment state to a non-full employment state through use of a shock, where the shock can be on the demand or supply side of the economy. Additionally, that shock can be positive or negative. Furthermore, with respect to these shocks, we saw that demand side shocks were capable of generating the co-movements we've seen in our annual U.S. data, more precisely, the negative short-run relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate. So, given this observation, we've been putting more attention on demand side shocks, where last chapter we revisited aggregate demand and were also able to determine that consumption and investment were key sources of demand side shocks. So then, now with respect to business cycles, what we need to do is be able to explain movement from a non-full employment state back to a full employment state. However, this will require us to make an assumption on the stability of business cycles. That is, once an economy is put into a non-full employment state due to a shock, how does it return back to a full employment state? Are business cycles stable, such that some secondary shock occurs, putting the economy back into a full employment state, or are business cycles not stable, such that the economy will need outside help in order to return to a full employment state? However, before we proceed to having this discussion, we should have a way for explicitly keeping track of the unemployment rate and inflation rate in an economy, as this can aid in our discussion in terms of are business cycles stable or not in terms of the assumption that we will use. Thus, to continue, we will develop the Phillips curve model that we see below that will allow us to keep track of our two rates as mentioned. So, with our task at hand, in order to develop the Phillips curve model, let us first recall what we know about the unemployment rate and inflation rate in terms of their co-movements, in which we've seen in our annual U.S. data that the two variables are negatively related to each other in the short run. However, in the long run, the two variables are independent from one another. Therefore, to keep track of the unemployment rate and inflation rate, our model should be able to take into account these two relationships. Therefore, we will have two components to consider, in which the first component we will consider is the long-run Phillips curve, in which the long-run Phillips curve represents the long-run independent relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate. We're looking at a graphic below. We have the inflation rate on the vertical axis and the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis. And in terms of our long-run Phillips curve, we see that we have a vertical curve, where the curve is vertical given that the unemployment rate is independent from the inflation rate in the long run. So instead, what the long-run Phillips curve is going to depend on is its intersection with the horizontal axis, that is capital U star, which is known as the natural rate of unemployment, where the natural rate of unemployment is the long-term unemployment rate in an economy, which we can think about as the typical amount of non-cyclical unemployment that exists in an economy. Where, turning to our annual U.S. data, we've seen that this is that average 5.74% unemployment rate in the U.S. when we considered 1949 through 2021. So, given that the long-run Phillips curve is determined by the natural rate of unemployment, then should the natural rate of unemployment change, then we will also see a change in the long-run Phillips curve via a leftward or rightward shift. Where, should the natural rate of unemployment decrease, that is, a reduction in the typical amount of non-cyclical unemployment in an economy due to some change in frictional, structural, or seasonal unemployment, then this will correspond to a leftward shift in the long-run Phillips curve, where an example of the natural rate of unemployment decreasing would be, say, due to a decrease in structural employment due to an increase in programs assisting those who are structurally unemployed relocate to areas in which their skills are being demanded, where with this typical amount of unemployment decreasing due to reduction in structural unemployment, this then corresponds to the natural rate of unemployment going from U star to U star 1, which is a lower amount. Given that the long-run Phillips curve is determined by this rate, this then corresponds to a leftward shift of the long-run Phillips curve from long-run Phillips curve to long-run Phillips curve 1 in purple. Whereas if the opposite case were true, in that if the natural rate of unemployment increases, then what we'll see is a rightward shift in the long-run Phillips curve, where a case for the natural rate of unemployment increasing would be the opposite of what we saw in our prior example, in that if there's an increase in structural unemployment on average in the economy due to a reduction in the amount of programs being offered to relocate these structural unemployed to locations to where their skills are being offered due to budget cuts, then what would occur would be an increase in the natural rate of unemployment. So in terms of our model, this would be going from U star to U star 1, where U star 1 is greater. And given that the long-run Phillips curve is determined by the natural rate of unemployment, this then means the long-run Phillips curve shifting to the right from long-run Phillips curve to long-run Phillips curve 1 in purple. So then, to summarize what we've seen is that the Phillips curve model will allow us to explicitly keep track of the unemployment rate and inflation rate in an economy, in which there will be two components to consider, given that the two variables are independent in the long run and negatively related in the short run, where thus far we've considered the long run component in terms of the long run Phillips curve, which represents the long run relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate, in which we saw it was determined by the natural rate of unemployment, in which we also saw that should the natural rate of unemployment change, then the long run Phillips curve will change via a leftward or rightward shift. So then with all this in mind, what we'll do next time is we'll develop the short run Phillips curve.